Like World War Three, you would say?
It could trigger World War III, yeah,
Okay.
which would not be good for the economy, I think,
No.
to put it mildly.
You are now tuning into BaisWave.
Welcome, dear listeners. Today we're at the Beehive Studio, and we have the privilege of hosting Dr. Casper Wits to talk about China and Taiwan's relations over the years. Dr. Wits, according to your bio, you are a lecturer in the Institute of Area Studies at Altay University, whose research focuses on post-war diplomatic and international history in East Asia. So can you just give a little bit of an introduction about what your work involves and what you've been doing so far?
So I'm a specialist both in China and Japan. So
Yeah.
I am very interested in the modern history of the East Asian region.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a lot in the Koreas as well, but I personally don't speak Korean language. I do speak Chinese and Japanese. And I spent quite a few years living in China, Taiwan, and Japan.
Mhm.
And I'm mostly very interested in the relationship between these countries. So that's what I write academic articles about, and also what a lot of my courses focus on.
Okay. My first question for you is, what do you think is the main reason why China claims Taiwan a part of its own territory?
It's a very long story.
Yeah.
The Chinese government, definitely, but also probably the majority of Chinese people believe Taiwan has always been a part of China since ancient history. The reality is that only for a few hundred years has it actually been under rule by mainland Chinese. And it was in the 17th century that actual migration from mainland China to Taiwan really took off. At that moment, in fact, there were other colonial powers present there. The Spanish, but at that time mostly the Dutch for a little over 40 years. And Taiwan was only incorporated into what was then the Qing dynasty in the sort of second half of the 17th century, and that lasted until the late 19th century. So you could say roughly 200 years.
Okay.
Then a lot of other things happened, and Taiwan became part of the Japanese Empire until 45. And the current conflict kind of has its roots in the Chinese Civil War, which took place over several decades, but especially intensive was the period from 45 to 49.
Between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the nationalists and the communists. And the communists won, obviously.
Yeah.
And the nationalists then retreated to the only territory of the Republic of China that they still controlled, which is Taiwan.
Yes.
And there they continue to the Republic of China. So the official name of the country is still Republic of China today. So you have the People's Republic of China, the Communist State in the mainland, and the Republic of China in Taiwan. So that's very, very broadly speaking what the conflict is about. Because the communists in mainland China do not recognize the Republic of China government. And they say that basically that government has stopped existing when we won the Civil War in 1949. And that means Taiwan has to be returned to the motherland.
Yeah. Okay. Then, like, to what extent do you think that China and Taiwan share this common cultural identity, like, based on how this relationship has unfolded over time, based on just their cultures and societies?
It's very hard to say. It's a very contentious subject. I mean, there was a lot of migration of Han Chinese, which is the majority ethnic Chinese, throughout those centuries that Taiwan was a part of the Qing dynasty. So the majority of people in Taiwan are Han Chinese, so ethnically the same pretty much as Chinese in mainland China. However, by the time that the Japanese colonial period ended in Taiwan in 1945, like the country had gone already through very unique and circumstances different from what was going on in mainland China. For starters, people there spoke Chinese languages but not Mandarin Chinese. So they couldn't really communicate with people from mainland China. And generally, like they were just doing their own thing in Taiwan, right? You have the Japanese roots, the Japanese past, you have their own practices. You also have indigenous people in Taiwan that were there already for thousands of years. That's just a very small group though. And probably the differences between China and Taiwan have grown rather massively over the last few decades as Taiwan has democratized. So for quite a while it was a right-wing democracy until the 1980s. But from the 1990s it has democratized very quickly and very successfully. And this means that right now, if you look at the values of people in mainland China and in Taiwan, like they have grown apart to such an extent that sure, they share like a common heritage, They share a lot of Chinese cultural practices like Confucianist influences, the practice of Buddhism, ancestor worship, those kind of things.
Yeah.
Also, the Taiwanese do speak with great extent Mandarin today. This has changed over the last few decades. But culturally, they have grown apart as well, especially when it comes to those things like having a democracy or being an authoritarian state or having free press or not having free press, those kind of things.
So their government structures, their languages, and their cultural values have all like differentiated.
Yeah, and for a long time already. So that's why it's very hard to see any kind of scenario for this being resolved in a kind of peaceful and calm way.
That's what makes it messy, right? Yeah. Okay, so far we've been talking about China and Taiwan in a local sense, but I also want to talk about how that affects the rest of the world. So my next question is like, what are the main global and local actors involved in this? Well, local actors, we've already kind of talked about it, but maybe there's more. And does it only affect East Asia, or does it have an indirect influence on the rest of the world? Like, what about the semiconductor industry, for instance, the economic side of it?
Yeah, a major player in East Asia is very much the United States as well, because the United States has had a lot of military bases in the East and Southeast Asian regions already since the end of the Second World War. So the largest number of US bases abroad, I mean, they have bases all over the world, right? But the three places where they have most bases are first Japan, second Philippines, third South Korea. So the US presence in the region is simply very important, and also their backing of Taiwan is the only thing that kind of prevents a Chinese invasion and a Chinese taking over of Taiwan. And that we've been in that situation since 1949. So if the Americans had not been there, probably the Chinese communists would have invaded earlier. So the United States is a very important player. Then in the region itself, I would say Japan is also very much involved in a potential conflict, because Japan's sea borders are very close to the Taiwanese ones. Plus, there are a lot of smaller Japanese islands, about 100 miles or 100 kilometers from Taiwan. Plus, the area around Taiwan is strategically very important for Japan, because it contains a lot of like shipping routes, shipping lanes, for example, that Japan depends on for its imports, especially of like natural resources like oil and natural gas. So for Japan, also like maintaining the status quo, so maintaining the situation as it is now, is kind of a priority for the United States probably as well. And I would say for the larger world, for us. All the way on this side of the globe too, like it's rather Taiwan is an important player, because as you mentioned already, the semiconductor industry, Taiwan is absolutely essential in those production chains. So it produces chips that are used for everything and only produced in Taiwan. So any kind of destruction of that facility would have major global consequences, and it's generally considered that a Chinese war against Taiwan will be much more economically detrimental on a global scale than the current Russian war against Ukraine.
So isn't that then one of the reasons why China is reluctant to invade Taiwan, because it would have this like major economic consequence?
Well, partially. I would say it's to a great extent it's also because of deterrence, right? They are afraid of a larger conflict with the US and potentially Taiwan, more than global economic consequences.
Okay. So we talked about the foreign side of things as well, like in terms of foreign affairs, and I also want to discuss the domestic side of things. So then how does their relationship affect the domestic politics and like society of each side?
Yeah, in China itself, I think there is great consensus that Taiwan is a part of China, and this situation that there's sort of this breakaway government, and they see it as a breakaway province, so to speak, that this should be resolved. And the current Chinese president, Xi Jinping, has said that this situation cannot continue forever. Like, we can't keep pushing this problem back to next generations. So it has to be resolved somehow. I think a lot of Chinese agree that this should be resolved, that Taiwan should rejoin. However, I do think there's probably a lot of wariness about starting a war and the consequences that a war would mean. For the Taiwanese, there's very little enthusiasm for this entire scenario. So about 10% of Taiwanese want any kind of unification with China. So the vast majority of them don't want it. And the majority of Taiwanese are very much attached to the democracy that they have established, to the freedoms that they have in Taiwan. things like having the free media, etc.
Mhm.
And they very much fear the idea of having to become part of a like authoritarian state like China. Yeah.
Okay. And why do you think that 10% wants to join China?
Good question.
Mhm.
To a certain extent, those are people that came with Chiang Kai-shek after the civil war ended.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably larger the older generations that still have a lot of attachment to the idea that they are Chinese and want to be part of China.
Okay.
Plus, it might contain some random people who do see, China's achievements over the last few decades as something to emulate. They might see the situation as inevitable, like that. There simply isn't a way for Taiwan to really survive in the current situation. So a collection of people, but yeah, very small group.
Okay. Then, based on the historical events that we've also discussed, how would you describe the current state of events, the state of the dispute right now, in light of especially recent events, especially after China's military parade in September and the election of Sanae Takaichi as a new Japanese prime minister? Do you think that China has sort of switched from this charm offensive, from this soft power strategy, to a coercion strategy that's more focused on hard power, and that does that make China's approach to Taiwan purely militaristic right now?
Yeah, I think that switch has happened. I do think it's gradual, though. Over the last 10 years or so, we're seeing that Xi Jinping, the current Chinese president, has been very aggressive in his language towards Taiwan, saying, that violence is very much on the table, a military solution is very much on the table. Even though the Chinese government says they would prefer to do this peacefully, they can do it through violence as well. And you see with military practices, military practice around Taiwan by Chinese Navy, basically. This has really increased over the last 2-3 years. And this is becoming increasingly threatening. And also the kind of investment that China is doing in its Navy is very much appears to show that there is preparation going on for a war against Taiwan. So that's a gradual process. I do think, the spat that's happening right now between Japan and China over possible Japanese involvement in order to help Taiwan. That's more of a diplomatic conflict between those two countries, which is significant, but I don't think it will change sort of the large scale sort of course of events in that sense.
Okay, so you're saying that there's actual substance behind these threats against Taiwan that China is making?
Yeah, if you look at their troop movements and behavior, the kind of navy they're developing, it's very much looks like they want to keep the option of military conquest of Taiwan very much, on the table.
Okay. Then we've talked about the past, we've talked about the present. So do you have any predictions for Taiwan's future?
Yeah, this is a very hard one. A lot of people ask me whether I think a war is going to happen.
Yeah.
The most important thing I think that I should always answer is that I think the Chinese themselves also do not know whether they want to start a war or not.
Okay.
Because it will depend on a lot of factors, some of them domestic, some of them international, for China to make that leap. For starters, the Chinese economy isn't doing well at all. There's a lot of problems with things like youth unemployment, a real estate sector that's completely bloated and putting a huge pressure on the treasury, and a lot of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is based on continuous economic growth. So promising people that their lives will be better year after year after year, and that is becoming a little bit, that promise is becoming a little bit, under pressure right now because of the economic problems. And that means that there could be a consideration that this might not be a good moment to start a war with Taiwan, which could lead to huge sanctions from the entire world against China, greatly harming their economy. And even worse, it could actually trigger a major war, possibly with the United States.
Like World War III, you would say?
It could trigger World War III, yeah.
Okay.
Which would not be good for the economy, I think, to put it mildly. So I do think these are things for China to consider. So it's very much will depend in the coming years, how the Chinese economy will develop. what the U.S. presence in the region will be. Like, if Trump will make any kind of retreating kind of movements of the U.S. troops from the region, then obviously war will come more likely.
Yeah.
This doesn't look like it's the case right now, by the way. Also things like they're really studying the sanctions that Russia is facing now because of the war against Ukraine. So there are a lot of very smart people in Beijing right now studying the sanctions on Russia, and in order to look like, can China withstand those kind of sanctions right now? But the reality is also that China is working on a long-term goal, for example, with the new 5-year economic plan, in order to make China much less dependent on the Western world, and vice versa, to make the Western world more dependent on China, and to diversify a lot of its trade also with the global South, or away from the West and more towards the global South. Now, if that really takes off and China becomes more and more economically independent from its ties with Western economies, then a war will also be more likely, because China would be hit less hard through economic means, economic coercion from Western countries that don't want China to start a war. So that's also something to watch. So basically, those are predictions of the future. Like, it can go either way, but those are the factors that we should take into account. And on the Taiwanese side, what's very important is to what extent Taiwan can find international support for its causes, for its cause. And there you do see among democratic countries over the last 10 years, like a greatly increasing solidarity with Taiwan and a willingness to speak up for Taiwan and international organs, international fora, and also more and more talk about possible military support for Taiwan. Definitely from the United States. I mean, that's already a given, kind of. I mean, I don't mean that the US will go to war for Taiwan. That's not a given at all. But the military support for Taiwan from the US. And this could also happen from Europe, from Japan, etc. So, and you do see more and more movement in that direction. So that's the other side of the equation.
Okay, so you're saying that even if China were to conquer Taiwan and succeed, that would create even larger problems that would be harder to deal with, right? Like a larger war, possibly World War III, but also in terms like locally, like Taiwanese people would keep resisting and it would still not be okay, and it wouldn't resolve the tensions really.
Yeah, in that scenario, the first big question would be, what does the US do? Like, they'll definitely give some kind of military support for Taiwan, but would they want to risk a complete war? It's a big question. The US is never clear about it. Also, to what extent will Japan help in those efforts? But especially because the Chinese don't know, this also will impact their calculations. So it might deter the Chinese as well, that they're afraid of such a big war. But that's a big question. But then, yeah, if China succeeds in conquering and subjugating Taiwan, or no, like first conquering Taiwan, like there will be resistance, as you say. Taiwan is a very mountainous country, so you could imagine like guerrilla forces being active in those mountains. There's a lot of like training in terms of civil resilience in Taiwan, of how people can resist their aggressors. But then if China does succeed in subjugating Taiwan, so basically winning that internal conflict as well, then you'll have a population of more than 20 million people, right now 24 million people, that really, really doesn't like to be in that situation, and probably won't so easily accept this authoritarian state being imposed on them. So who knows what that might look like. It will look like anything but a peaceful reunification, which is what China sometimes talks about. That's a fantasy. It will never happen.
Yeah. And do you think it could even escalate to like a nuclear war with the involvement of maybe like North Korea, or would that be like very unrealistic?
I don't really see that danger so much. North Korea is completely focused, I think, on their main concern is South Korea. And I don't think they'll be involved in this conflict at all. Of course, if there is like a military conflict between the US and China, that is a question you could ask. At the same time, like, you have to understand, I think, that the Chinese, a big difference between the Russians and the Chinese, although they're really good friends, fellow authoritarians who don't respect human rights and are both have expansionist ambitions. A very big difference between the two is that the Chinese are nowhere near as careless in how they think and talk about nuclear weapons, and their military doctrines are like within their military doctrine, like there is a huge threshold for using any kind of nuclear weapon, to the extent that basically the Chinese do not believe in using them unless another power is using it against them. And this is very well known. So I think it's actually much more if such a large war breaks out, which of course we hope that will not happen, it's much less likely to become a nuclear war than a large war between the US and Russia, for example.
Okay, yeah. I brought it up because I mentioned the military parade in September, and there we saw like Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and Putin together. So I thought of like, what if they would ally together? And
yeah, it's a good question. In a way, they are allying together already to a certain extent, and helping Russia and Ukraine, etc. At the same time, like China and its abilities to attack Taiwan, like they can do that without help of anyone else. And I don't think the help of Russia and North Korea will be that essential, and then most likely they will not actually be militarily involved, as in sending troops themselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then, like, as an extra question, do you have any last comments that you would want to talk about, or
maybe a little bit the current issue with Japan and China? That why exactly, like the Japanese Prime Minister, what she said was so controversial. I think maybe it's interesting to delve into very, very briefly.
Yeah, sure.
So she said that a Chinese war on Taiwan would be an existential threat to Japan, or a survival threatening situation, she said literally. This has a lot to do with those shipping lanes that Taiwan is on, as well as the fact that the Chinese conquest of Taiwan would give China access to the western side of the Pacific Ocean, to the extent that they could be just become very threatening for Japan as well. So a combination of those factors, and the reason why China pretty much went ballistic, like in their reaction, was so angry about it, is because they really dislike any kind of discussion about this potential conflict as anything else but an internal matter. So they very much see the whole Taiwan issue as internal affairs of China. So any discussion about how other countries would help Taiwan in such a situation is a direct interference in Chinese internal affairs, and that's kind of unacceptable.
That's threatening to their sovereignty, you're saying?
Exactly, yeah. Because Taiwan should be an inalienable part of China, they think. Therefore, any country saying things like what the Japanese just said is threatening indeed to China's sovereignty. That's a good way to put it. And in that way, China is also sending a message by treating the Japanese very harshly. They're sending a message to the democratic world, like, don't even think about getting involved and helping Taiwan in this situation. Because, and this does, to me, show a little bit of panic, that they do not really like the fact of what they're seeing over the last 10 years, with the issue of Taiwan more and more coming on at the forefront of the strategic concerns of a lot of countries around the world, and much more willingness to help Taiwan as well. And the Chinese don't like it, and by lashing out like this, I think they're trying to let us know.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being here today with us and accepting our invitation.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation.
We expect to see you here again, so maybe soon, maybe sometime later, but hopefully we'll see each other again. Thank you very much.